Until last year, I thought the most annoying thing about my mother-in-law was her habit of comparing me to men I had never met. I had no idea she was eventually going to pick one of them as my replacement. And the truly impressive part was that she almost convinced my wife it was her idea. My name is Dean. I'm 35. I've been married to my wife Allison for 7 years, and until all of this happened, I would have described our marriage as boring in the best possible way. We didn't have screaming matches, nobody threw plates, nobody dramatically packed a suitcase at 2 in the morning and drove off into the rain while sad music played in the background. We were just good. We had jobs, bills, inside jokes, a mortgage, a shared hatred of our neighbor's leaf blow. Then there was Susan, my mother-in-law. Susan was 59 and one of those people who could insult you so pleasantly that sometimes you didn't realize you'd been insulted until you were driving home. She never raised her voice, never swore, never openly criticized me. She just had observations, lots and lots of observations. For example, we'd be having dinner and Susan would casually say, "Carol's son just bought a beautiful house." I'd look up from my food. Good for Carol's son. 4 bedrooms. That's a dangerous amount of bedrooms. Allison would kick me under the table. Susan would smile. With a pool. Even more dangerous. Or we'd be sitting in her backyard and she'd suddenly announce, "Jessica's husband got promoted again." I didn't know Jessica. I didn't know Jessica's husband. As far as I knew, neither of these people actually existed. But apparently, Jessica's husband was absolutely crushing it. Every few months, this mysterious bastard got another promotion. Then there was Cameron. Cameron was different because I'd been hearing about Cameron for years. Cameron took his mother to Hawaii. Cameron just bought another property. Cameron's business is doing incredibly well. Cameron cooked Thanksgiving dinner for his entire family. At some point, I became convinced Cameron wasn't a person. He was a collection of motivational quotes Susan had somehow given a driver's license. Allison found it just as ridiculous as I did. "Mom, nobody cares," she'd say. Susan would give her that innocent little smile. "I'm just making conversation." "No, you're reading us Cameron's quarterly earnings report." I'd laugh. Susan would laugh. Everybody would laugh. That was the thing. Back then, Allison and I were always on the same side. If Susan compared me to someone, Allison shut it down before I even had to. If Susan made some little comment about our house, our vacations, my job, or the fact that we weren't spending enough money on whatever she thought successful adults were supposed to spend money on that month, Allison rolled her eyes right along with me. I never saw Susan as a threat to my marriage. She was my wife's mother, not a Bond villain. And besides, Allison and I were happy. At least, that's what I thought. The first time Cameron stopped being a name in one of Susan's stories and became an actual person was at a backyard barbecue I didn't even attend. Susan had invited us over on a Saturday afternoon. I was supposed to go, but a project at work had entered that special phase where 6 adults stare at the same problem for 9 hours and somehow make it worse. So Allison went without me. When she came home that evening, I was sitting at the kitchen counter with my laptop open and the remains of what I generously considered dinner. She dropped her purse on a chair. "You remember Cameron?" I looked up. "The legendary Cameron?" She laughed. "Yes. Owns property, loves his mother, possibly rescues puppies between business meetings. That Cameron. What happened? Did he cure something?" "He's back." "Back from where?" "I don't know. Wherever successful people go." She opened the refrigerator. "Apparently he moved back to the area a few months ago. He got divorced." That caught my attention mostly because Susan had somehow failed to include Cameron's divorce in her regular newsletters. "Wait, Cameron gets divorced?" "Apparently." "I'm shocked. I assumed his marriage had perfect credit." Allison laughed again. Then she told me Cameron had been at Susan's barbecue. His mother, Carol, was one of Susan's oldest friends, so it wasn't exactly strange. What was strange, although not yet suspicious, was Susan's reaction. Apparently, the second Allison and Cameron were in the same backyard, Susan became very interested in their childhood. "You two used to get along so well," Susan had said. Allison stared at her. "Mom, I was like 14. Susan waved a hand. "I'm just saying." Allison told me the whole thing while standing at the refrigerator eating strawberries straight from the container. I remember smiling. "Careful." She looked at me. "What?" "Sounds like your mother is trying to marry you off." Allison snorted. "Little late for that." "At least divorce me first. I don't want the paperwork getting confusing." She walked over, kissed the top of my head, and stole one of the fries off my plate. Deal. That was it. That was Cameron's grand entrance into our marriage. And if you'd told me then that, within a few months, I'd be sitting across from that same man comparing notes about the lies my mother-in-law had told both of us, I would have laughed in your face. But at that point, none of it seemed serious. Cameron was just Cameron, Susan was just Susan, and Allison was still coming home and telling me everything. I didn't realize how important that last part was until she stopped. At first, Cameron's appearances still looked random. Allison would stop by Susan's house after work. Cameron was there. Susan asked Allison to help pick out a new dining table. Cameron was there. Sunday brunch. Cameron. A broken cabinet hinge. Cameron. I finally asked Allison, "Does your mother have a Cameron subscription now?" She laughed. "I think she does." The important part is Allison was still telling me everything. She'd come home and say, "Guess who was at Mom's again?" I'd answer, "Let me think. Barack Obama?" Cameron. Shocking. And then Susan started doing what Susan did best. Comparisons. Cameron is such a good cook. Cameron fixed that whole thing himself. Cameron is so attentive. Cameron has really built a nice life. None of it was direct enough to argue with. That was Susan's talent. She never said, "Dean isn't good enough." She just described another man until you were supposed to reach that conclusion yourself. Allison still found it funny. Then work got bad. Really bad. I was managing a project that had already missed one deadline, and every person involved seemed determined to prove it could miss another one with even more confidence. I started staying late, then later. I canceled dinner plans twice in 1 month. One weekend trip got pushed because something broke at work Friday afternoon, which is apparently when all important things decide to die. Allison was frustrated. She had every right to be. One night she told me, "I feel like I barely see you." I apologized. I meant it. I told her the project would settle down. She believed me. Then she complained to Susan. That was where everything changed. Allison told me about the conversation later. She'd expected her mother to say the usual things. Marriage is hard. Dean is under pressure. You two need to make time for each other. Instead, Susan said, "You let him get away with too much." Allison apparently frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means you're always the understanding one. He's working. Everybody works." Then Susan said something Allison remembered almost word for word. "You're 33. You do understand you don't have to live like this for the next 40 years, right?" Allison got angry. "Mom, I love Dean." And Susan immediately backed off. That was another thing she was good at. She could throw a grenade into the room and then act surprised by the noise. "I didn't say you don't." "Then what are you saying?" "Nothing. I just want my daughter to be happy." When Allison told me, I rolled my eyes. Classic Susan. She smiled, but not as much as I expected. After that, the comparisons changed. Before, they were annoying. Now, they had a purpose. If I worked late, Susan said, "Cameron owns his schedule." If I wanted to save money instead of taking an expensive trip, Cameron understands you only live once. If I forgot to pick something up from the store, Cameron is always so thoughtful. At some point I told Allison, "I'm starting to think Cameron should just move in and take over my responsibilities." She didn't laugh. And that was the first time I noticed something had shifted. Not with Susan. Susan had always been Susan. with Allison. A few weeks earlier, when I came home late, she'd say, "I miss you." Now she'd say, "A man who cares about his marriage finds the time." That wasn't how Allison talked. I remember looking at her and thinking, where did that come from? I already knew the answer. I just didn't understand yet how much of Susan's voice had started living inside my wife's head. Before we get back to the story, if you're enjoying it so far, subscribe to the Steel Heart channel and leave a comment below. And if you want to help the channel grow, share this video with a friend and use your hype points on this video. It takes just a moment, but it helps Steel Heart reach a much bigger audience. All right, back to the story. The first time Susan stopped being subtle was at dinner. She invited Allison and me over on a Saturday night. "Just dinner," she said. When we arrived, Cameron was already there. Of course he was. I looked at Allison. She gave me a small shrug that said, "I didn't know either." Cameron stood up and shook my hand. That was actually the annoying part. He was perfectly normal, friendly, relaxed. No weird looks at Allison. No smug attitude toward me. Nothing that would justify me immediately hating him. I would have preferred a villain mustache. Something useful. Instead, he offered me a beer. Dinner started normally. Then Cameron mentioned he'd recently gotten back from a trip to Europe. Susan immediately looked at Allison. "Allison has always wanted to go." Allison glanced at her. "I've been to Europe." A few minutes later, he mentioned renovating his house. Susan lit up again. "You should see it, Allison. You'd love his kitchen." I put down my fork. Apparently, I had entered a sales presentation. Cameron kept talking, either oblivious or pretending to be. Then Susan said, "You know, you two are actually very similar." Silence. Allison stared at her mother. Cameron stopped chewing. I waited about 3 seconds. Then I smiled. "Yeah, it's almost like you're trying to set my wife up with him." Nobody laughed. Susan looked at me as if I'd accused her of poisoning the water supply. "Excuse me? I'm joking." "That's a very strange joke." I looked at Allison, expecting the usual eye roll. Instead, she looked irritated. At me. "Seriously, Dean? What? At my mom's table?" I almost laughed because I genuinely thought she was kidding. She wasn't. "Allison, your mother has spent the last hour explaining why you and Cameron should apparently share a kitchen and tour Europe together." Susan's face tightened. "I did nothing of the sort." "Okay. Dean," Allison said sharply. That was my cue. I shut up. The rest of dinner was painfully polite. Cameron changed the subject twice. To his credit, he looked more uncomfortable than anyone. On the drive home, Allison was quiet. Finally, she said, "You embarrassed me." "I embarrassed you?" "You made it weird." It was already weird. My mom was making conversation. "Your mom was one PowerPoint slide away from showing us wedding venues." "See? That's exactly what I mean." I looked over at her. "What? You can't just turn everything into some conspiracy because you're jealous." That word caught me. Jealous. I hadn't been jealous. Annoyed? Absolutely. Suspicious? Starting to be. But jealous? No one's jealous of Cameron. Then why did you say that? Because your mother was being incredibly obvious. Allison sighed and looked out the window. "Can we just drop it?" So I did. The next day, Allison told me she'd spoken to Susan. She said she understands why it looked bad. That's almost an apology. "Dean, sorry. And she won't invite Cameron when we're coming over anymore." I nodded. Great. Problem solved. And I actually believed that. What I didn't know was that Susan had given Allison a second piece of advice during the same conversation. I wouldn't learn about it until much later. She told her, "Just don't mention Cameron to Dean anymore. He'll turn everything into a problem." And Allison listened. That was the line we crossed. Before that dinner, my wife told me every time Cameron was around. After that dinner, she stopped. She simply decided that hiding things from me was easier than dealing with my reaction. And Susan had managed to convince her that this wasn't dishonesty. It was just keeping the peace. For the next few weeks, Cameron basically disappeared from our conversations. I assumed Susan had kept her word. That assumption lasted until a Thursday afternoon. Allison had told me she was meeting Susan for brunch. Nothing unusual. What Allison apparently didn't know was that Susan had also invited Carol and Cameron. The second Allison walked into the restaurant and saw him, she stopped. "Mom, seriously?" Susan looked genuinely offended by the accusation. "What?" "Cameron." Susan glanced at him as if she'd only just noticed the 6-foot man sitting at her table. "Oh, please," Carol invited him. Carol apparently became very interested in her coffee. Cameron looked uncomfortable. Allison should have left. She didn't. She sat down. And that was exactly how Susan worked. Nothing was ever big enough to justify making a scene. Every individual thing had a perfectly reasonable explanation. "It's just brunch. He's just Carol's son. Everybody knows everybody. Why are you making this weird?" So Allison stayed. After they ate, Susan suddenly remembered she needed to run an errand. Carol, in what I'm sure was one of history's great coincidences, needed to go with her. They left Allison and Cameron sitting there alone. Then Cameron leaned back and said, "Okay, is your mom trying to do something here?" Allison laughed. "Welcome to the club." I thought maybe I was imagining it. "You're not." Cameron hesitated. Then he asked the question that should have ended the whole thing. "Does Dean know you're here?" And Allison answered, "Why would he need to?" Cameron didn't have a good response to that. Of course, I didn't hear any of this from Allison. I learned it later. At the time, I knew absolutely nothing. That evening she came home, kissed me hello, asked what I wanted for dinner, and never mentioned Cameron. 2 days later, I was working from home. We had a family iPad sitting on the kitchen counter. Allison used it more than I did, mostly for recipes, shopping, and watching shows while cooking. Her messages were synced to it. I wasn't snooping. I didn't pick it up. I didn't enter a password. I was making coffee when the screen lit up. Susan. How did it go with Cameron? I stared at the notification. For a second, I honestly thought I had misunderstood it. Then another message appeared. "See? I told you how different it feels when a man actually listens to you." I stopped making coffee. A third notification appeared. "Just don't mention it to Dean. He'll make it into something it's not." I stood there looking at the screen. That last sentence was almost funny. Because until that exact moment, Susan had been right about one thing. I had been treating it like it was nothing. I hadn't checked Allison's phone. I hadn't asked where she was every 5 minutes. I hadn't told her she couldn't see her mother. I'd trusted my wife. And apparently, while I was doing that, my mother-in-law had been coaching her on what not to tell me. I didn't confront Allison when she got home. That surprised even me. Normally, I'm a big believer in dealing with problems immediately. But this wasn't a forgotten anniversary or an argument about money. I didn't even know what I was looking at yet. So I waited. For the next few days, I paid attention. Not to where Allison went, to what she said, and, more importantly, what she didn't say. Susan called. Allison walked into another room. Her phone buzzed during dinner. She flipped it over. Small things. Things I'd probably seen before and ignored because that's what trust does. It makes suspicious behavior look ordinary. Then, a few days later, the iPad gave me another gift. This time, I didn't just see one notification. I saw enough of the conversation to understand what Susan had actually been doing. She wasn't simply comparing me to Cameron. She had been discussing our divorce with my wife. For months. There were messages about my work, our arguments, our finances, whether Allison was wasting her best years, whether she'd be happier with someone more available. And Cameron kept appearing in those conversations like a product Susan was slowly recommending. Then I saw one message that made everything else look almost innocent. Susan had written, "I'm not telling you to cheat. I'm telling you to make sure you have somewhere to land before you jump." I read it twice, then a third time. There it was. The entire plan in one sentence. Don't leave Dean yet. First, make sure Cameron wants you. My mother-in-law wasn't encouraging her daughter to fix her marriage. She wasn't even encouraging her to end an unhappy one. She was telling my wife to keep me until she'd secured my replacement. Apparently, after 7 years of marriage, I wasn't a husband anymore. I was the current tenant. I still didn't confront Allison, partly because I was angry, mostly because I wanted to know one thing before I did anything stupid. How much did Cameron know? So I found his number. Calling the man my mother-in-law had apparently selected as my replacement was not on my list of things I expected to do at 35, but life likes to keep you humble. He answered after a few rings. Hello? Cameron, it's Dean. There was a pause. Hey. Not exactly thrilled to hear from me. Fair. I need to ask you something. Okay. You know Allison is married, right? Another pause. Obviously. Good. Just establishing the basics. What is this about? Do you know Susan is trying to line you up as my replacement? Silence. Then Cameron actually laughed. Not smugly. More like I just asked whether he was involved in an international conspiracy. Dean, what the hell are you talking about? I figured you'd say that. Because I have no idea what you're talking about. So I told him. The brunches, the dinners, Susan's messages, the comparisons. Then I read him the message about making sure Allison had somewhere to land. Cameron stopped laughing. She said that? Word for word. He was quiet for several seconds. Then he said, Okay, we need to talk. We met the next evening at a coffee shop. Cameron arrived before me. He looked less like my romantic rival and more like a guy who'd just discovered he'd accidentally joined a cult. I sat across from him. He got straight to it. Susan told me you two were basically separated. I stared at him. What? She said you and Allison had been having problems for a long time. We've had problems. That's called marriage. But right now we only have one problem, and that's my mother-in-law. No. She made it sound like it was over. How over? Cameron rubbed his forehead. She told me you were only still living together because separating finances would be complicated. I almost admired it. Susan hadn't just been lying to Allison about Cameron. She'd been lying to Cameron about us. What else? She said you were planning to move out. I laughed. That one genuinely got me. I'd love to know where. I'm serious. So am I. Apparently I should start packing. Cameron shook his head. Then he told me Susan had been feeding him information for weeks. Allison was unhappy. Allison felt ignored. Allison wanted more from life. Allison and I were just going through the motions. And every time Cameron questioned why Susan kept inviting him when Allison was there, Susan gave him the same answer. They're basically done. Cameron leaned back. I thought she was separated. She sleeps next to me every night. Yeah, I know that now. Did anything happen between you two? No. He answered immediately. I watched him. Nothing? Nothing. We talked. That's it. Did you want something to happen? He thought about that one. I thought she was attractive. At least he didn't lie. But married is married, he continued. The only reason I didn't think those lunches were completely insane was because Susan kept telling me your marriage was already finished. I believed him. Not because I suddenly trusted Cameron with my life, because his anger made sense. Susan had used him too. He pulled out his phone. I have messages. That was when things got even worse. Susan had written things like, give her time, she's scared to make the change, and once Dean moves out, she'll finally be able to breathe. There was just one small problem. Dean had no plans to move out. Dean didn't even know Dean was supposed to move out. Apparently, everyone had received the schedule except Dean. Cameron looked at me. What are you going to do? I haven't decided. You haven't talked to Allison? Not yet. He nodded slowly. Then his expression changed. Susan's having people over Saturday. I know. It was another backyard barbecue. Carol would be there, a few relatives. Allison was already planning to go. I hadn't been invited. Or, more accurately, Susan had mentioned it to Allison while somehow forgetting I existed. Cameron picked up his coffee. He looked at me for a moment, then said, "You should come." I smiled. "I'm pretty sure Susan would disagree. That's why I'm inviting you." For the first time since this whole thing started, I actually liked Cameron. Not enough to let him marry my wife, but enough to accept a barbecue invitation. Saturday afternoon, I drove to Susan's house. I didn't warn Allison. Cameron didn't warn Susan. When I walked into the backyard, Susan was standing near the grill talking to Carol. She saw me and froze. "Dean?" "Hi, Susan. What are you doing here?" Before I could answer, Cameron spoke from behind her. "I invited him." Allison was sitting at the patio table. The second she looked at Cameron, then at me, I watched the color leave her face. She knew. Maybe not exactly what I knew, but enough. Susan recovered quickly. "Well, that's certainly unexpected." "I'm sure." Nobody knew what to say after that, so I decided not to waste everyone's afternoon. I looked at Susan. "Why don't you tell Allison what you've been telling Cameron?" Her expression changed. "I don't know what you mean." Cameron stepped forward. "Tell her they're basically separated." Allison looked at him. "What?" "Or tell her Dean is planning to move out." Allison turned toward her mother. "Mom?" Susan gave a nervous laugh. "Oh, for God's sake, Cameron misunderstood me." "No," Cameron said. "I didn't." Carol had stopped talking entirely. A couple of relatives nearby were now pretending very badly not to listen. I pulled out my phone. Susan also told Cameron that our marriage is basically over, that Allison and I are only living together because of finances. Allison stared at Susan. "You told him that?" I was trying to explain the situation. "What situation?" "Good question. I would have liked the answer too." Susan looked at me. "This is completely inappropriate." I almost laughed. "You've been secretly auditioning replacements for me, but I'm being inappropriate? That is not what happened." Then I asked Allison the question I'd been holding on to for days. "Did you know your mother was already promising another man a future with you?" "No." Her answer came immediately. She looked at Cameron. "I swear I didn't know." Cameron nodded. "I believe you." Susan jumped in. "I never promised anyone anything." Cameron pulled out his own phone. "Want me to read your messages?" That shut her up. Carol stepped closer. "Susan, what exactly have you been telling my son?" Susan looked trapped now, her daughter on one side, her best friend on the other, me standing there, and Cameron holding receipts. So naturally, she chose the classic defense. "I was only trying to help." Allison stared at her. "Help me do what?" "Be happy." "By telling Cameron my marriage was over?" "You've been miserable." "No, I've been frustrated." Susan looked at me. "Because of him." There it was, finally. No polite smile, no innocent little observations, just the truth. I looked at Allison. She was crying now. "Dean, my mom manipulated me." "Yes." Then I continued. "But she didn't make you lie to me." Silence. "Dean, you stopped telling me Cameron was there. I knew you'd get upset." I nodded toward Cameron. "We already talked." Allison looked between us. "There was nothing physical." "I believe you." "Then why are you acting like I cheated?" I kept my voice calm. "That's the problem, Allison. You don't have to sleep with someone to destroy trust." She started crying harder. I hated seeing it. But I wasn't going to pretend she was just another victim of Susan's plan. "Your mother gave you permission to hide things from me. You chose to use it." Susan interrupted. "This is exactly why she couldn't talk to you." Cameron actually laughed. Everyone looked at him. He shook his head. "Wow." Susan glared at him. "What?" "You lie to me for months, lie to Allison, try to push us together, and somehow Dean is still the problem." Carol looked at Susan with a disgust I'd never seen before. You used my son. I did not. I was trying to. Stop saying you were trying to help. That came from Allison. Susan went silent. Allison wiped her face. For once, Mom, just stop. And she did. The barbecue was pretty much over after that. Turns out public exposure is terrible for the appetite. I didn't go home with Allison that night. After the barbecue, we sat in my car for maybe 10 minutes without saying much. Finally, Allison asked, "Are you coming home?" "No." She started crying again. "Dean, please. I need some space." Nothing happened with Cameron. I know. That was the part she still couldn't seem to understand. This wasn't about catching her kissing another man. Honestly, that would have made the situation simpler. There would have been a clear line, and she either crossed it or she didn't. What happened instead was months of smaller choices. She hid meetings. She discussed our marriage with her mother while Susan was actively trying to replace me. And when she realized Cameron kept appearing wherever she went, she didn't tell me because Susan had convinced her that my reaction was the real problem. I packed a bag that evening and stayed with a friend. Allison didn't try to stop me. For the first few days, we barely spoke. Then the messages started. "No, you're overreacting. No, nothing happened, so get over it." Mostly apologies. One evening she sent me, "I've been trying to figure out where Mom's manipulation ended and my choices started. I don't think I can separate them anymore. But I know I chose to lie to you." That was probably the first message that actually mattered. Because she wasn't pretending Susan had controlled her like a puppet. Susan had manipulated her. But Allison had participated. A few days later, we met for coffee. Allison looked exhausted. "I should have left that first brunch when I saw Cameron. I should have told you every time he was there." She looked at me. "You could occasionally make this easier. I've had a difficult month." She almost smiled. Almost. Then she said, "I don't know why I let it go that far." I did. Because Susan had never asked her to do anything huge. She hadn't started with, "Leave your husband and date Cameron." She started with, "Dean works too much. Dean doesn't listen enough. Dean doesn't prioritize you. Cameron does." Then it became, "Don't tell Dean Cameron was there. He'll overreact." Then, "Maybe you should know what your options are." Every step was small enough to justify the next one, and Allison had kept taking them. Meanwhile, her relationship with Susan completely collapsed. Allison stopped answering her calls. Susan sent texts, then emails, then messages through relatives. Apparently, several family members received some version of, "Dean has turned Allison against me," which was impressive. I'd somehow become responsible for a conversation I hadn't even been invited to. Susan also insisted everyone had misunderstood her intentions. She wasn't trying to break up our marriage. She was protecting her daughter. She wasn't trying to push Allison toward Cameron. She was showing her that she had options. She hadn't lied to Cameron. She had merely simplified a complicated situation. Cameron had a different opinion. He blocked Susan. Then he told Carol everything. That friendship didn't survive. From what Cameron later told me, Carol was furious that Susan had used her recently divorced son as some kind of emergency replacement husband. Cameron and I spoke one final time. He apologized again. I told him I believed he hadn't known the truth. Then we agreed, without actually saying it, that neither of us needed to become friends after this. There are some relationships that don't need a second season. A few months passed. Allison and I started marriage counseling. We were still living separately. Counseling wasn't some magical montage where we talked for 45 minutes, cried, and walked out holding hands. Some sessions went well. Others made me wonder why I'd agreed to come. There were days when I missed my wife so much that going home felt obvious. Then I'd remember sitting in our kitchen reading Susan's message telling Allison not to mention Cameron to me. And suddenly it wasn't obvious anymore. The hardest thing wasn't forgiving Allison for meeting Cameron. It was trusting that, the next time someone convinced her I was the problem, She'd talk to me instead of quietly building a life around me. To Allison's credit, she never used Susan as an excuse again. She eventually said something during counseling that stuck with me. My mom opened the door. I walked through it. That was probably the first time I thought our marriage might actually have a chance. Not because it fixed anything, because at least we were finally arguing about what really happened. 4 months after the barbecue, Susan mailed Allison a letter. An actual letter. Several pages. Allison brought it to one of our counseling sessions and let me read it afterward. It contained every defense Susan had already used. She loved Allison. She had been worried about her. She never meant to hurt our marriage. She believed Cameron was a good man. She thought Allison deserved someone who had more time for her. She was sorry everyone had misinterpreted what she'd been trying to do. And near the end, Susan wrote, "I just wanted a better life for you." Allison stared at that sentence for a long time. Then she folded the letter. "Aren't you going to answer?" I asked. She shook her head. "No." And she didn't. Maybe that doesn't sound significant. But after 7 years of watching Allison explain, defend, argue with, forgive, and eventually surrender to her mother, silence was probably the strongest answer she could have given. As for us, I still don't know. We're trying. Some weeks are better than others. Maybe we'll stay married. Maybe one day we'll decide too much was broken. But whatever happens, at least the decision will finally belong to Allison and me, not Susan. And looking back, the scariest part wasn't that my mother-in-law found another man for my wife. It wasn't even that she lied to Cameron and told him our marriage was already dying. It was how slowly she managed to change what my wife considered normal. One comparison, one complaint, one secret, one harmless lunch, one deleted message, one perfectly reasonable excuse at a time. Until Allison was sitting across from another man without telling me and genuinely asking, "Why would Dean need to know?" Susan never had to convince my wife to cheat on me. She almost did something smarter. She convinced her that hiding things from me was reasonable, that our problems were proof our marriage was failing, that Cameron wasn't another man. He was simply an option, a place to land. And by the time I realized what Susan was doing, she'd almost convinced Allison that destroying our marriage had been Allison's own idea all along. If you felt this story hit hard, drop a like, subscribe for more, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support keeps Steelheart beating.